On today's show, we'll be talking about watersheds. We have the pleasure of having Harry Stone as our guest speaker. I've really learned a lot from Harry, and I feel really lucky that our paths have met. And Harry, tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got involved with this.
Thanks, Erin. I appreciate this opportunity to be here. As you know, I am an Ohio Certified Volunteer Naturalist. That's part of my volunteer work. I also serve as the Vice Chair of the Ohio River Basin Alliance. In my work experience, I was a senior research scientist with Battelle and worked on ecological problems around the country. My background includes a multidisciplinary PhD in ecology, political science, and economics.
That's a lot.
It took a while to figure out I knew enough.
And I truly have learned a lot from you. And we're out on the water a lot together, doing watercraft programs, but I've also learned a lot about algae and watersheds in general. So tell us what you've learned about watersheds.
Well, that's a good question. Everyone lives in a watershed, and yet most people don't realize that they live in a watershed, or what their watershed is, or even what a watershed is. And you might ask, well, why should we care? And the answer is because the health of the watershed matters to us. An unhealthy watershed is one in which beaches will be closed, in which fish and shellfish are unsafe to eat. Soils will be eroding off of farmers' fields, impacting their productivity. Our plant and animal communities are impaired. And our drinking water treatment becomes more of a problem. So to answer your question, a watershed is an area of land that drains into a lake or a river or a bay or an ocean. A watershed's also called a basin. And so you can think of it just like a sink basin, where any water that goes into the sink is going to drain or go down to your drain. And so similarly, in a watershed, all the water, wherever it is in the watershed, goes down to that lake or bay or ocean.
It's interesting because I think everyone knows that water is important, but I think that a lot of people don't understand what a watershed is. So
it's this collecting basin. And it starts with the headwaters. And when you think of headwater streams, these are the little streams that form when you have a rain or snow melt. And some of those little streams are only going to be inches wide or a foot wide. You can step across them. And yet those are the important waters that are collecting, or the important streams that are collecting the water throughout the watershed. And they bring it together. As those run together, you get bigger and bigger. The stream gets bigger and bigger. And so you go from those headwater streams that you can literally step across to the middle reaches of the streams that are wider and slower, and you would have to wade across or swim across. So along the rivers and streams are flat areas that are called floodplains. And these are areas where the creek will occasionally overflow its banks. And along that floodplain is what is referred to as a riparian zone. And a riparian zone is the land bordering the stream that has water-dependent plants that like living in areas that flood occasionally. And this floodplain and the riparian zone together are very important. The plants stabilize the banks. They reduce the flooding and downstream flooding. These are areas that drop out the nutrients and the sediments that are in that water, keeping it from polluting the water downstream. And it is also a very important area for plants and animals. A lot of the migration routes for birds, for example, go right along these riparian zones, and it helps make them attractive places for bird watching.
So I have people's friends and family that live along the river, and it's natural human behavior to want to clear off the stream bed there so you can have a clear path to the water. But but it makes sense that you would want the plants there to help hold the soil in place. And like you said, it also gives habitat and helps filter through any pollution that might be coming down.
Yeah, and so as you do clear land and use it for various purposes, it's just important to think about how much to clear and strategically where to clear so that you keep that riparian zone intact as much as you can to be able to help with flooding issues and to be able to help take out the sediments.
Yeah.
So another question you might ask is, well, just how big is a watershed? And most people have heard of a continental divide. The continental divides are the places where on one side the water flows in one direction and on the other side it flows another direction. The big one that runs from Alaska down to the very tip of South America is the Great Divide. And so everything to the west of that flows into the Pacific, and to the east flows into other watersheds. In Cedar Creek State Park is located within the Mississippi River watershed, which is bounded by that Great Divide to the west, by the Appalachians and the Eastern Divide to the east, and by, in the northern part of Ohio, the St. Lawrence Divide. And so that we are part of this very large Mississippi River basin. But you can think of watersheds as being nested, like the Russian dolls, that you open one and there's more and you open another one, or like our address, where we can talk about we live in the United States, but we also live in Ohio, we live in Lebanon, and so forth. So as we go a little deeper into the Mississippi River watershed, we will actually talk about being in the Ohio River watershed. But the Mississippi River watershed is huge. It is 1.25 million square miles. It is the fourth largest watershed in the world. It also, the Missouri runs down into the Mississippi, down in the Gulf of Mexico. When you look at that whole river, it is the fourth longest river in the world. So we're part of a very large watershed. At that level, there are some issues. The Mississippi River watershed is highly agricultural, and farmers need nutrients on their fields, the nitrogen and phosphorus, and they need good soil on their fields. But when there's erosion and you have runoff, that goes down our rivers and streams, down into the Gulf of Mexico, and those same nutrients will feed algae in the Gulf of Mexico. And so you get large algal blooms that then die, sink to the bottom, decompose, and that decomposition takes the oxygen out of the water, and that kills fish, kills shrimp, and other sea creatures. And as a result of the nutrients getting into the Gulf of Mexico, there actually is a large area referred to as a dead zone where these animals cannot live. And in 2017, that dead zone hit a record of 8,700 square miles, very large. To say the least, this is not good for commercial fishing. Well, we're going to open up our nested dolls and go from the Mississippi River watershed into the Ohio River watershed. And here I'm going to introduce the concept of hydrologic unit codes. And these are numbers that are assigned to each watershed. If we're talking about it at the big level, like we're part of the United States, it's a two-digit code, 05 being the Ohio River, 06 being the Tennessee and Cumberland River Basin. And HUC codes are used very commonly. And so you might ask, well, why would we do that? Why don't we just call it by its name? And the answer is names aren't adequate. It turns out, do you have any idea how many mill creeks there are in the United States?
No.
Me either. I can tell you there are 13 in New York alone. There are 2 in Ohio. So if we tried to identify our streams just by calling them by their names, we would have a problem because it would be very confusing. So that's why the two-digit HUCs are used. Now we're going to go one more step in with our nested dolls, and we'll take a look at the Little Miami watershed. And this, you'll remember the Ohio River was HUC 05. Within that is the Middle Ohio region, so that's 05, 09. Within that, we get to the Middle Ohio Little Miami River Basin, 05, 09, 02. As we get more precise with our address, it's 05, 09, 02, 02. And so we're now looking at the Little Miami subbasin where the Cedar Creek State Park and our Nature Center is located. A few of the facts about this now smaller subbasin is we know that it's located in Ohio and it drains into the Ohio River. It has portions of 6 counties in that watershed, that sub-watershed. Clark, Greene, Warren, Clinton, Montgomery, and Madison. It drains 657 square miles. 657, you remember the whole Mississippi River watershed was 1.25 million. So you can see how it's just a very small part of this big picture. It's a glaciated area that has thick deposits of silt, sand, and gravel. The key tributaries in the Little Miami subbasin include Cedar Creek, Massey Creek, and Beaver Creek. And then there's some dams in that area that provide us with water, backed up water, and these include the Cedar Creek Reservoir. And this is a wonderful area because it includes state and national scenic river, actually the first in the country, I believe. Land use is mostly agricultural. So when we talk about that big picture problem of nutrients going down into the Gulf of Mexico, we are part of both the problem and the solution here. We'll go in one final step, and now we're to the Cedar Creek watershed itself. And we have added 04 to the end of our address. In the Cedar Creek watershed, we have some of those we have the tributaries that are those headwaters, those little small streams and that are flowing into Cedar Creek and Massey, and those are forming those creeks. So we are part of the headwaters for the entire Mississippi River basin.
So why are watersheds important?
Watersheds are important because climate plus watershed characteristics really are the key drivers of the kind of ecosystems we would see in an area. And we know this. We know what climate does. If I tell you that we have very little precipitation and very hot weather, you know what kind of plants we're going to have there. We're going to be in a desert. We're going to have cacti. Or if I tell you there's a lot of rain and it's very hot, you would know we're in a tropical rainforest. So those characteristics are very important. And then the types of ecosystems that are there are critically important for helping us with many, many things that we need. So when we talk about an ecosystem being the plants and the animals, the bacteria and the fungi, and the way that they interact with things that aren't living, like soils and air and water, those interactions do a lot of things for us. For example, lichens on rock will decompose a rock and form soil, and we need soil. Likewise, plants are able to take water and carbon dioxide out of the air, sunlight, and make sugars. So that's the base of our food chain. So those are things that they just do because that's what the ecosystems do. But when they are of value to us, we refer to them as ecosystem services. These are the goods and services provided by nature that benefit humans. And EPA has a generic list of those, and they include ecosystems clean the air, They provide clean and plentiful water. This includes storing water and filtering water, providing source water. Climate stabilization, planting trees in cities can help cool cities. And certainly trout like it a lot better along a stream where they've got trees over it to help keep it cool. Natural hazard mitigation, we talked about flooding and how good floodplains and riparian zones can help reduce downstream flooding. Recreation, culture, and aesthetics, we really value this at Caesar Creek. We love getting out in our canoes and kayaks and doing our bird watching. Food, fuel, and materials, everything from timber for our houses to the food we eat. Medicines, many medicines come from nature. Biodiversity conservation. We appreciate the diversity of birds that we have in our area, which makes bird watching a lot more fun than if it was just one or two. And so these services are valuable. How could we grow crops if we didn't have the soils? And how much more would it cost to treat drinking water if the ecosystems didn't help us? Well, New York found an answer to that one. They were going to have to put in a drinking water treatment plant, and the current cost to put in that plant is $10 billion. But they found that they were able to protect their ecosystems, and the ecosystems would do the filtering of the water sufficient so they didn't have to put in that $10 billion plant and did not have to spend $100 million per year to operate it. So
just like natural plants versus a man-made plant.
Exactly. And the man-made is a lot more expensive to put in and operate than when nature does it for us.
Yeah, so why do we need to be concerned with ecosystems?
Well, humans have a significant impact on ecosystems. And we can both have an impact by helping protect and restore them, but also there are ways in which humans negatively impact the ecosystems. And there's a little acronym, HIPPO, that we use to kind of remember what some of those things are. And the first is habitat destruction. When we drain wetlands, that destroys the wetlands, it destroys the ecosystem functions and services, and we lose those ecosystems. So habitat destruction is an example. Invasive species. In Caesar Creek State Park, we have Amur honeysuckle and autumn olive. And these are species that a few hundred years ago weren't there at all. And they got introduced accidentally into the environment here. And as a result, they have taken over our understory in a lot of our areas, and that shades out the plants that provide our wildflowers in the spring. And so it changes the ecosystems in a way that we don't necessarily find desirable. Pollution is another, and a lot of times people think of pollution just in terms of factories or wastewater treatment plants that have a pipe coming out and going into the stream or river. And yes, those have been sources of pollution. But at this point, they're pretty well regulated, and they have to have a permit. They have to have treatment in order to release that water. The bigger problem at this point are what are referred to as non-point sources, and that's where it isn't a pipe. It's my yard and farms and various roads where rainwater will wash the fertilizer I put on my lawn down into the stream, or pollutants off the roads down into the streams and lakes, and cause problems. One of the problems we're seeing right now with that is with harmful algal blooms, where nutrients, those nitrogen and phosphorus that we want on our lawns to green up our grass, when that gets into the streams and rivers, we grow the algae that causes problems.
So yes, the river looks a lot different now than it did when I was a kid, because there was cars, and my grandpa would say, "Oh, it's just holding up the bank," you know. And we'd had cows walking in and out of the water everywhere, and soil is a point of pollution too, right?
Yes, yes. When you get sediments going down into the streams and rivers, they will cover the rocks and the gravel and so forth that is the habitat for the little critters, the insect larvae and so forth, that are the food for the fish. And so that does create a problem.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I wanted to point out, when we talked about ecosystem services, you might want to find out about ecosystem services in your watersheds. The website where you can go and do that, if you do a Google search for EnviroAtlas, it will bring you to an EPA site. You can go in there and you can put in the name of your stream, or better yet, your HUC, and it will give you a chart which will let you select the ecosystem services you're interested in. And you can then find out how many folks are bird watching, or how many folks are hunting or fishing or doing other things to use those ecosystem services.
So by finding out how many people are bird watching in that area, what does that, how does that benefit?
Well, there is real value in bird watching. People value that. And it's a way to help estimate just how much value that does have. What is it worth to someone? Well, we know it's worth something because they get in their car, they come over, they buy the binoculars, they spend their time when they're doing bird watching when they could be earning money, and they're choosing not to. Mm-hmm. So it's real value. It's hard to estimate, but it helps give us a sense for how much people do value these ecosystem services.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
One of the things about ecosystem functioning services and their value is that it is really complex. So in the visual that's showing on the screen, we have topsoil, which is very important for providing crops, which impacts our farm value. And then we also use those to feed livestock, which produce manure, which we then put back on our fields to fertilize, all good things. But when we lose that topsoil or lose that manure through erosion, it impacts our water quality, which can then cause harmful algal blooms, as we described, which can have produce toxins, and this can have a human health impact. This can have fishing impact, recreation impact. Literally in Grand Lake St. Mary's, another state park, they have had to prohibit people from going in the water and sometimes even boating because of the harmful algal blooms. And that has a real cost to tourism, to land values, and to recreation values. And so the more that we can help people appreciate the real value of our ecosystems, the more likely they are to care about protecting it.
Yeah.
And so that kind of leads me into watershed groups. And one of the things, I hope that we have managed to pique folks' interest a little bit in watersheds today. And I would encourage people to get involved with their watersheds. There are watershed groups for 85% of the watersheds in Ohio. So likely you can find a group to get involved with. For example, the Little Miami Watershed Network has a vision to collaborate to restore and protect the Little Miami watershed. So that's a great place to get involved. And our watersheds are networked through Ohio State. And you can go to the ohiowatersheds.osu.edu and search for your watershed by name or by HUC, and be able to find where the watershed groups are that you can connect with there. The purpose of this OSU extension to have this watershed network is to connect and educate professionals and volunteers working to apply watershed management principles to address water quality, quantity, and aquatic habitat issues. And they're focusing on the non-point sources of pollution through collaboration, working together so that we have win-win situations. And they're working on collaborative watershed planning and management. And that requires interested parties, which are often called stakeholders, to be involved in developing and implementing these strategies. And so when you think about, well, what kind of an impact can we have, part of the impact comes from asking a few questions. For example, what pollution and what amounts can be dumped into a water body, into a river or stream or lake? And the answer is, well, the US EPA or the state regulatory agencies regulate that in some cases. In other cases, like when I put fertilizer on my land, that's strictly up to me as a landowner. If you have a loss of ecosystem function, when I do cut down those riparian zone trees and pour me some sand in there and make me a beach, and that takes away some ecosystem functioning, who makes that decision? And in some cases, that would be the Corps of Engineers, U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. In other cases, it's the landowner. Impoundments of water bodies. If I want to put up a dam or a levee, who decides? In some cases, it's Corps of Engineers. In some cases, it's landowner. And what about the diversion of water? What if I want to run a pipe from Cincinnati, from the Ohio River, down to Georgia and sell them the water out of the Ohio? Who decides who gets to use that water? Well, that's really complicated. And watershed groups, by understanding what's going on in their watershed and by collaborating with the various folks within the watershed, they can influence through adequacy and collaborative decision making those decisions and the impact that they would have on our ecosystems.
So how can we become involved? Through one of those groups?
Yeah, yes, and through going to the OSU website and looking up your watershed group, you could get involved in that local level. And then if you wanted to get involved at a bigger level, I'll talk a little bit about what that might look like. And so when I say a bigger level, we talked about how watersheds are nested, and we can get right down to that address of the Cedar Creek watershed. But if we back, and there are certain ecosystem functions that are going on at that level, but if we back out to the bigger level, we can look at the Ohio River Basin, for example, and look at the ecosystem services there. And fresh water in the Ohio River Basin has an annual value of between $36 and $105 billion on an annual basis. Wow. The food, the crops, livestock, poultry, has an annual value of $181 billion. And so that includes the food that's produced in the Cedar Creek watershed. Timber, $66 billion. Structures protected by flood control, including those floodplains, $76 billion. And then freshwater and forested land recreation, $13 billion. And so what I hope you're seeing is that those ecosystem services are really large dollars, and they benefit different groups of people. So one of the challenges at the Ohio River Basin watershed level is, how do we make decisions about that? So if there is a drought and our water levels in the Ohio River are getting lower, do we use that water to irrigate crops? Do we use that water to maintain navigation so we can move our coal to the power plants? Do we divert the water to the highest bidder, sell it to Georgia if they're willing to pay more than the power plants to use our water? Or do we use it to maintain our ecological flows and protect the mussels and our paddlefish and our other special fish in our streams and rivers? So with those kind of questions in mind, a group has been formed, the Ohio River Basin Alliance, that is looking at this large watershed level and working together on a basin-wide strategy. This slide just shows some of the organizations that are involved in our steering committee and advisors group. We have monthly calls working on these collaborative efforts. And what I hope you'll notice is it includes a commission, the Ohio River Valley Water Sanitation Commission, an 8-state commission. It includes universities, Tennessee Valley Authority with their interest in hydroelectric power, the Corps of Engineers, watershed groups, Miami Current Conservancy District, flood protection groups, the Silver Jackets. So a wide variety of people who can come around the table and collaborate to be able to answer some of these tough questions about how we make decisions and what our strategy should be for the Ohio River Basin. And the really great news is that with sponsorship from ORSANCO, the Ohio River Valley Water Sanitation Commission, they have provided fiscal sponsorship for ORBA. Kentucky has stepped forward with $150,000. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers has come forward with $200,000. And so we've put together a $400,000 project for the development of an Ohio River Basin-wide strategic plan. And that is now underway. It is being worked as we speak. So the basis for this plan comes out of the collaborative work that has already been done in the Ohio River Basin by ORBA. And it includes 8 goal areas. These include ensuring adequate water supply, flood control and risk reduction, growing our economy, specifically more jobs and higher paying jobs, increased nature-based recreation. The paddle sports we love so much are in this strategy. Transportation, this is multimodal transportation, but with a focus on using the Ohio River as a way to increase our river commerce. Research and education so that we can answer the questions we need to make smart decisions, and adaptive management. We know about climate change as something that doesn't look so bad now but could be bad in the future, and how do we address it? But there are other things that also provide non-linear, that is, things look good till they're not, challenges like earthquakes. And we know that the New Madrid fault's down there, and we're in an area that could have an earthquake. So those are the major goal areas that we have been talking about. And then to kind of summarize what we're hearing, it's the priorities at this point, and they're subject to change because we're getting input right now, but maintaining the authorized river levels, making sure that we have adequate pools in the rivers to float our boats, to have drinking water, to take care of our aquatic species. Feed the farms, starve the streams. We want to make sure that farmers are highly productive, that they have the nutrients and soils on their stream, on their lands that are so important for their crops. By the same token, we want to starve the streams. We don't want nutrients and pollutants and soils to be going into the rivers. Sustaining healthy ecosystems and vibrant economies. Again, we want to make sure all of our ecosystems stay intact and continue to do their functioning. At the same time, we want to be growing those jobs in the Ohio River Basin. Stop invasions. We've talked about the invasive species, and we want to prevent more invasive species and mitigate the problems that have been caused by invasive species so far. An important one in the rivers right now are Asian carp, and they're in our Ohio River Basin watershed, and they're being monitored. We got to figure out a way to stop them because they do cause problems. Similarly, quagga mussels and zebra mussels have caused enormous problems in the Great Lakes, and they challenge the really diverse worldwide richness of our mussel communities here.
It's amazing to look at the big picture, you know, how the water connects all of us. I mean, a great distance and a really wide variety of people.
It is the basis for our way of life. It is the basis for our quality of life. And if we don't take care of it, we lose our beaches, we lose our fishing abilities, we lose our drinking water, we lose our crops. And so we are water rich in this area. But it's something we should not just ignore and take for granted.
Right.
We need to appreciate it, protect it, and plan for its use.
Yeah.
And so with that in mind, I've invited people to get involved with their local watershed. But I would also encourage you to get involved with the Ohio River Basin Alliance. We will have our summit, our 2019 summit, on October 2nd through 4th, and that'll be at Ohio University. Everyone is welcome to come to that. At that time, we will have panels, and we will be discussing the priorities and strategies that are being developed to get further input from folks in the basin to make sure that we're coming up with the right collaborative strategies. If you want to get involved earlier, if you want to be part of that strategic planning process, certainly just let us know. And you can do this. You can go to the Ohio River Basin Alliance.com, one word, Ohio River Basin Alliance, and that will give you a way to join ORBA. There's no charge for that, and it'll help you get involved and know what's going on in the basin. If you want to go ahead and be commenting on what you think the priorities ought to be, or some groups that we ought to be talking to get their perspectives on what the priorities ought to be in the basin, you can send your comments to orsanko@USACE, that's United States Army Corps of Engineers, .army.mil, and we will, it'll be part of the official comments for this planning study. And I really, the whole point is that watersheds are important, and taking care of the watersheds is important. And understanding those interrelationships and what happens to farmers if we do this, or what happens to the environment if we do this. That's all very, very important. And the ideas of the people who live in this watershed are important. Your priorities are important. And so I really would encourage folks to share their ideas and to have a positive impact on their watershed, whether it's at the local level or at this broader Ohio River Basin level.
Yeah. So, Harry, you sure have opened my eyes on a very broad basis. Things that I didn't think about before, you know, how we're all connected and how we can impact the ecosystem. Just one person, what a great impact they can have, and how large the watershed is. So I appreciate the work that you're doing to bring these people together, the different user groups, and just the information and the wisdom that you've shared. So
glad to do it. The project will be just as good as the input we get from people living in the watershed.
Yeah. It's so very important. So that's it for today's show. If you'd like more information, you can check out the websites that Harry provided. You can also check us out online at CaesarCreekStatePark.com, and we'll see you on the trail.